Hi, thank you all for joining us today. I think we're ready to begin. To repeat the earlier housekeeping points before I hand over to Rob and Kimball, everyone has been muted on entry, so please send any questions through to the Hayes WebEx host and we will endeavor to answer them at the end of the presentation. Without further delay, I'm happy to hand you over to Kimball Norup and Rob Moffat.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on embracing the global contingent workforce management. My name is Kimball Norup. I've been in the broader contingent workforce space for roughly the last 17 years in a number of line and leadership roles. My role as head of growth for Hayes Talent Solutions spans across marketing, sales, channel, and steady-state account management. I'll be your host on today's webinar, getting us started as well as wrapping things up at the end. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce you to our expert today, my esteemed colleague, Rob Moffat. Rob, you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Kimball. Hi, everyone. My name's Rob Moffat. I'm our SVP for Solutions and Innovation. Bring that to life, my role is responsible for the development of services for our clients, particularly expansion into new territories. I've been lucky enough to work for Hayes for quite a period now, and I've been based initially in the UK and Europe, then spent 4 years over in the Asia Pacific region, and I'm now based in the US, looking after the Americas. So what we'll be talking about today will be hopefully bringing to the table some of my real life experiences and some of the clients that I've worked with. Handing back to you, Kimball.
Very good. Thanks, Rob. Now, as you've heard, Rob has extensive multi-regional global operating experience at Hayes, and I think he may have sold his experience short. But I think we truly couldn't have a more knowledgeable presenter on this topic today, so I'm really excited for us to get into that. Now, the agenda we put together today is obviously a brief intro, both to ourselves and just a high level on who Hayes Talent Solutions is as an MSP. Then we're going to get into a quick review of how we believe the world of work is changing. And then we'll get into the primary meat of the presentation today, really looking at some global considerations. And in true storytelling format, we really feel like this topic matter will come to life with a little bit of a case study. So we've structured the presentation today around one of our real life clients, and we'll talk through how that program came to be and evolved, and a lot of the global considerations that they went through, and we helped guide them on to bring that program to a very successful operating mode that it is today. And then we'll wrap things up with a brief conclusion, a few best practices, some tips that we've learned over the years, and then we will absolutely leave time at the end for Q&A. And I guess a reminder for everybody, please feel free to ask questions during the presentation using the chat functionality within WebEx, and we'll endeavor to get to them either in real time or we'll reserve them if it makes sense for the end of the presentation. Now with that, I'd like to just give you a quick high level on Hayes. Now this overview slide is certainly not intended to be a commercial for Hayes Talent Solutions, but rather a little bit of context on Hayes Talent Solutions, and also hopefully to instill a little bit of confidence in the audience here that we do know what we're talking about when it comes to global contingent workforce management. Now, many of you who may have had global operating experience may have heard of Hayes. We're actually the 6th largest staffing firm in the world. And like many of the companies of that size, we've structured ourselves into two divisions. We have the staffing side of the house and we have the managed services side of the house. As an organization, we've been in business for 50 years, operate in 33 countries, have roughly 10,000 team members, actual staff employees of Hayes, delivering both recruiting services and managed services across the globe. We operate, again, in 33 countries. We have about 120 managed programs around the world with just under $4 billion in spend under management. Now, I'm often asked, what makes Hayes different or unique? And I think there's a few things that just wanted to plant in the audience here. First is our global footprint and expertise, really all about local service with global knowledge and insight. and that's enabled by a global network of integrated service centers, international service centers. We also take a talent-forward approach to being an MSP, and I'm often asked, what does that mean? And it really means that our job is to enable the supply chain for a client so that everybody is focusing on delivering the right talent at the right time and place at a fair cost, regardless of source or worker classification. One of the other unique things we do is direct sourcing, which I think we'll touch very briefly on in this case study that we're going to share today. But that is one of the differentiators of Hays around the globe. Next slide, Rob. Now, I'm really excited about today's program because the topic of globalization of a contingent workforce program is something we hear a lot about from mid-market and enterprise clients and prospects pretty much every day that we're out in the market. With the world of work changing at such a rapid pace, from both the supply side of talent as well as the demand side of talent, business is also becoming much more global, and this specter of talent scarcity is becoming a common challenge that many companies are facing. We're also seeing more companies are doing business globally, and more companies are relying on a globally distributed contingent workforce in order to get work done. So obviously implementing a program for managing the contingent workforce on a global basis, something that provides the governance, process, and visibility and enablement across an organization is becoming very strategic. One final observation around globalization that I find fascinating is in all the conversations we have, it's equally applicable regardless of the maturity of the program that we're talking about, whether it's a client that's really looking at implementing a program for the first time, and even some of the more mature second and third generation managed programs. The topic of globalization is still red hot, and with frequency comes up as a real critical strategic challenge that clients want to address. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it off to Rob to get into the details of our presentation. So Rob, take it away.
Thank you, Kimball, and welcome everyone. As we said at the agenda, the plan for today is to go through, give you an idea of looking at the globalization program, what should you take into consideration, and then using a live client example, how might that map to a particular client, what were the options available, and what is the route that they took to their current position for you. Okay, so taking that in order, there are many considerations when looking at a program and looking at globalization, but there are three primary ones that I'd like to call out, and we will then dive into in a little bit more detail. The first one is around the objectives and benefits. So what is the purpose of going down this route? What are you trying to achieve? Is it a risk play? Is it a cost? And what is the rank of those? What is the importance? But also quantifying them. And interestingly, I'll be talking about quantifying these at a total level, but also on an individual worker level as well. I'll expand on that a little bit in a second. Second up is the cost of implementation. So, and when I say cost there, I'm looking at both indirect and direct costs. So both money expended, but also everything from the resources, to the goodwill, to the change management. And obviously the two of those together effectively build your ROI or your return on investment or business case. Once you've got those, there's some slightly more practical and pragmatic bits, and this is one of the cultural and legislative considerations that you've got to take into account. Okay, so what are you trying to achieve and what's the benefit? How much does it cost you to implement? And then what are the things that you need to consider to make sure that works for you as an organization? Okay. To bring this to life, we're going to use this as a case study. So the case study we'll be using today is based on one of our real clients. They're a financial services organization, a global financial services organization, and also an organization I've been lucky enough to work with directly in helping roll out these services in the UK and Europe, over in Asia Pacific, and also a client we're working with closely over in the US here. Yeah. We have removed some of the confidential information and round it out, but there are no material changes that would to the facts and figures. but it does give you a good idea or an understanding of how that might work in a real client environment. Okay. So, as I said, it's a financial services organisation. To give you a bit of a background, they're largely broken into 4 geographic regions. And those 4 geographic regions don't come as a big surprise based on the financial centres, but they have a large centre in the US, centred around New York, a large centre in the UK, centred around London, large presence in Asia Pacific, a little bit more disparate, but centred in Japan, Hong Kong and Singapore, and then a presence also over in Europe. And that's a bit spread around. They've got a number of centres that deliver services to the rest of their business. Okay. And I'll be revisiting that. I'll be talking about them as an organisation broken down into those areas, because it gives a good idea of, the comparing, contrast, the different considerations, the different pressures, but also the different opportunities and solutions you might have in those different areas. Okay. So that's them as a geographic scope. The colour coding goes through as well. So I'll be pointing out how this all maps back to the geography. So them as an organisation. So they're looking at what are their objectives and what is the benefits realisation. So along the graph there, you'll see the territories that we cover, and you'll notice that called out on the left-hand side are the sort of the primary volume locations. Again, not surprising, the UK and the USA are the 2 larger locations, again, London and New York. And then following it down, Singapore, Hong Kong, Poland, Australia, and then what I might describe as a long tail, predominantly in the Asia region, but also extending out into other parts of Europe. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the profile of the population. But what we were talking about was what are the objectives and where are the benefits for you. And again, I said I'd talk about this both at a total level or an aggregate level, but also at an individual country or worker level as well. So if you look at the main areas, sort of the main volume locations, this is obviously the area where the largest total benefits might come to you as an organisation, or largest aggregate benefits. And again, there's a number of benefits you get in there around risk, control, but also cost and quality as well. And they're pretty much obvious to most individuals. What may be less obvious is around the benefit in what I refer to as the long tail. This might be a smaller total of the population, but it's a large number of territories. And therefore, actually having a better visibility and control of this population does allow benefit around from a risk perspective and, from a control perspective. Okay. From the left-hand side, we've got the territories that might give you the highest benefit on an aggregate basis. From the right-hand side, you get significant benefit on a per hire or per worker basis, and very much often around visibility, control, and the risk management. It's how do you balance those within one program to ensure that you get the capture of all of those benefits. Okay, so we've looked at the geography. Now we've looked at, what are the benefits, or what are the objectives, or where are the potential benefits for this program. Okay. The second thing you've got to implement is to realise these benefits. Where's the cost for you? And again, this is both direct and indirect costs. An easy way you find of looking at this is to map it onto a simple matrix. And if you imagine on the horizontal axis or the x-axis, staffing market flexibility. So, what does the market look like? What is the legislative environment? What is the cultural environment for you? And then on the vertical axis or the y-axis, what is the MSP penetration? Is it a common program and therefore a relatively easy sell? Easy sell to the stakeholders and easy rollout, or is this a greenfield site? Are you breaking new ground? And obviously, the further on to the right-hand side, the more flexible the environment you're working in, and the further up on the vertical axis, the easier the implementation. And obviously, both of those are going to contribute to what's the cost, direct and indirect, is of you setting up this program. Okay. What we've then done is map those 4 territories on these 2 axes, and we've also used the size of the bubble to show you sort of the scale or the size of the population opportunity in that area. Okay. In simple terms, you'll notice the UK and the US, both sitting in what I refer to as the top right. Again, they are relatively, well, they are mature markets for MSP, and they're relatively flexible within staffing. There are some complications in there, but at least the landscape is understood, and there are relatively well-defined rules of engagement. Moving across to the left slightly, you have Europe and Asia Pacific, slightly more complex regions. So MSP is a less familiar concept. So, often you're having conversations for the first time with either a supplier or a line manager, whereas in the UK and the US, those individuals or those companies might be used to the concept. And again, from a staffing market flexibility, some of them don't have, some of those environments aren't as mature or sophisticated in how they apply for the legislation to the temporary worker. For example, in the UK, there is specific legislation covering temporary workers. In some other territories, it's effectively an adapted version or a mapped version of permanent legislation. Okay, so they're the 4 territories we've got for this organisation. So you can see it's quite obvious for the UK and the US where it fits, but there's obviously some complexity within the APAC and EU. Yeah? And then it goes one step further. I mean, just taking one of the examples, take APAC. APAC is not a country. Yeah. APAC, or standing for Asia Pacific, is in fact obviously a group of countries, and they all have their individual complexities as well. So breaking this down one step further for everyone, I've taken some of the key territories, and again on the right-hand side, you'll notice Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia mapping closely to the UK and the US. Again, not a complete coincidence. They do have some common heritage, particularly from a legislative complexity, which means that they're quite close. But then over to the left-hand side, we have in places like India, Japan, and the rest of Asia as well, which might have either more complex legislation or the concept of an MSP isn't as common. So, for example, in Japan, an enormous temporary worker population, but not a huge number of MSPs there, and the actual legislation that is then mapped to those temporary workers is quite restricted in some areas of what you're going to do. Okay. So the context for everyone as well. So if you look at it, top right-hand corner, the cost for implementation per worker is lower. And then again, looking back at, say, Hong Kong and Singapore there, or historically or previously the UK and the US, you've got a lower cost of implementation on a per worker basis, and then a higher aggregate benefits realization as well. So the business case might be quite obvious there. Conversely, in the bottom left-hand corner, the implementation of these kind of programs or services is higher per worker, and the benefits realization isn't as great on an aggregate basis as well. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking at an MSP in this area or a type of contingent worker program, but it might be that you're looking at different versions of the same thing. And we'll come on to what those options might look like. Okay. So again, the second one, the first one is around what you're looking at is the, where is the benefit and what is the type of benefit. Second part of your business case is what effort, spend, or cost is it going to take me to realise those benefits? Two parts of the same coin. Again, like it doesn't mean you shouldn't be looking at, but again, it just means what your tax law or tactical approach to these countries might be different. Okay. And then third up is culture and legal framework. There's a number of different cultural bits. I'm not planning to go on a country-by-country basis on what they might be, but there is one key thing that's probably worth looking at, and this is around legal frameworks. Okay. There's two primary contracting structures that operate for an MSP. And the first one is what we refer to as the direct contracting structure. And this is the contracting structure that is familiar to those of us who've worked either in the US, the UK, or a number of the other common law countries. So, for example, in this example, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. And in these environments, the first contract is between the clients and the MSP provider or the contingent worker program provider. And this might be a combination of a master services agreement and local enabling agreements. So, go on to the structure a little bit later. But that's the primary contract. And under the direct contract, the MSP or contingent worker manager then holds the contract with the third-party suppliers. So what this allows is a single contract for the delivery of the whole service, and the responsibility for the management, the negotiation, and the ongoing performance measurement of the suppliers can then obviously sit with the MSP. Significant benefits from both sorts of a process and risk perspective for an organisation. Just to complete the picture, the third party that's usually involved is the VMS provider or vendor management system provider. And the contract can either be with the client or a subcontract to the MSP or contingent worker. In this example, I've got the contract direct with the organisation, but again, it can be one or the other. And then completing the picture, to enable the work for that, you would have licensing agreements. Okay. This would be the standard or the most common contract structure in what I refer to as the common law countries. I think I said at the beginning, but just to reiterate, the US, the UK, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia, most of those other countries. Okay. But it becomes more complex when we look at some of the other countries, particularly in places like Europe and also Asia Pacific, where within legislation, if an organisation is using the services of a temporary worker in some shape or form, then that organisation must have a direct relationship contractually with the organisation payrolling or providing that worker. So the structure we're going to be talking about is, for example, required in Japan, where you can't do what they refer to as double dispatch, so the MSP can't sit in the middle, but also in a lot of Europe, particularly for temporary workers. Interestingly, not for contractors, and a contractual relationship, because it's regarded as a business-to-business relationship, it can flow through the MSP, but for a temp, which is much more analogous to an employee, the relationship must be direct. So what does this look like? So the client would have an agreement with the MSP, and this will give it authorization to do run the managed service, the sourcing, the screening, the selection of the workers, and run the process management and the performance management. But the organisation would actually be required to have a contract direct with that supplier. Okay, so it's both a contractual relationship, and obviously that would then flow down into an invoicing and payment relationship as well. Okay. In some instances, the MSP could manage some of the payments on behalf, but in straightforward terms, the relationship and the invoicing would usually be directly. Again, just completing the picture, the same as above. There's a VMS that would be involved, and then the various different parties using the VMS would also require a licensing agreement. Okay, so that gives you the consideration. So we've gone through there, what was the geographic scope, and then the primary ones, what are your objectives, what are the benefits you're looking for, where could they be realised, and what is the size of realisation. Secondly, what will be the effort and cost in realising those benefits, both at an aggregate level and an individual country and worker level. And thirdly, what are the considerations you need to take out from a cultural or legislative perspective, and particularly looking at that from a contract perspective. Okay, so that's a bit of background. So what I'm going to move on to now is what are the options available for you, and then how did this particular organisation map those different options onto their objectives, where have they got to in the journey, and what are some of the benefits that are coming out. So what are the options for you to manage your contingent worker or temporary worker population? If we look at the life cycle of a temporary worker, in simple terms, we start off with demand or requisition. So somebody saying, this is the worker that I'm looking for. Then going through the sourcing and selection process, obviously a compliance and onboarding process. And then while they're within the organisation, there's timesheets, there's payroll, then there's payments, invoicing and payment for those workers. And again, at the end of the life cycle, we have the offboarding of those workers. Okay. There are a number of different flavours of what a contingent worker solution or an MSP solution could look like, but they fall into three primary buckets. What I'm going to refer to them as a direct relationship or a direct service, and this is a full procure-to-pay or P2P solution. An indirect, which is largely similar to a direct from a front office or recruitment perspective, so requisition, sourcing, screening, but this is the one that I was referring to earlier, where the contractual relationship and therefore the invoicing and payment would have to be with the vendor, and then an on and offboarding service. So this might be for categories of workers where they're sourcing or the engagement's done outside the process, but what we're looking to do here is capture those individuals. Where are they? What are they doing? Where have they been here? From a risk and compliance perspective. So what does this look like? So from a direct, it would cover the whole full to P2P cycle. So your MSP or contingent worker program provider would have sole accountability and largely and responsibility for delivering each one of those steps of the process. Obviously, they'd work with subcontracted vendors, supplier partners, other individuals or other organisations within the process, but what you've got there is a single source of accountability for the end-to-end process. And again, any of you who are currently based or have worked in UK, US, Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., that would be the most commonly recognised model for you as an organisation. Okay. The second model is the indirect model. As I said, at the front end, it looks and feels pretty much the same as a direct model. So actually, as a hiring manager or a manager trying to engage an external resource, the indirect and the direct model look and feel pretty much the same. Okay? The difference comes in the downstream processes when we're looking at the payroll or the payments to workers, and then the invoicing and payment cycle as well. So each of the primary recruitment tasks could be run by your MSP or contingent worker provider, but the other tasks, timesheeting and payroll, would be tasks that would be delivered directly by your supplier in country. Okay? So the first two give you a lot of benefit on quality, risk, visibility, and control. Indirect, there's slightly less of the benefit from a process efficiency side, but most of the other benefits are delivered for you in pretty much a seamless way. Okay. The third model I just wanted to touch on is on and offboarding. So this might be, for example, outsourced workers, workers engaged under a statement of work, or it might be a smaller country or a remote country where a full end-to-end service might not be financially practical, but you still want to understand what population you have there. So this is confirming the compliance, managing the onboarding, and managing the offboarding as well. So under the on and offboarding, you still get the visibility, you still get the control, you still get the risk management, you also get some of the cost management. You just don't get it's not the full level of service that you've got with the first two. At the same time, the cost of implementation and management of that service is significantly lower as well. So it's definitely worth the consideration, going back to the original graphs earlier, your smaller populations or your smaller countries or possibly your outlying categories as well. Okay. And also it's not one size fits all, and you can mix and match, or this could be a shopping list, and you can deploy a selection of these different services within an overarching global program. Okay. So what we've covered there, we've looked at what does the organisation look like, what were the challenges and what do they have to take into consideration, what were the options available to them on a globalised basis, and now what I'm going to do is bring that all together, and as an organisation, how have they mapped that, how have they got the best return on investment and the best delivery in country on a case-by-case basis, but under a global framework. Okay. So as a quick summary, what I'm going to go through is what's the scope within the 4 regions. So I've taken the 4 regions again. We've got the UK, Asia Pacific, the US, and Europe. So what's the scope of the project? What's the contracting structure? What's the people structure to deliver it? How do we do the sourcing? And then how does the technology fit together? Then I'll bring it together with the evolution. This wasn't a big bang. This hasn't happened overnight. This is a long journey we've been on with this organisation, and I will show you how that's all come together. Taking these in order. So first up, we're looking at what model do they operate. Okay. We've got temps, contractors, and statement of work or outsourced. In some areas, what a temp and contractor is a little bit blurred, or they're largely treated similarly. In some countries, there's a very defined difference between those. But in the UK, we operate a direct model. So that means that we hold a single contract with the organisation, and we hold the contracts with the suppliers. And that covers both temporary workers, referred to as PAYEs, and contractors or limited companies. So again, to a line manager perspective and largely to an invoicing, it looks pretty similar, okay, because it's a direct contract. And then for the SOW or outsource, again, it's not a full pure-to-pay service, but we're involved in the onboard and the offboarding. What that means for the organisation is for their non-permanent workers in the UK, they have visibility and control over 100% of that population for them. Moving on to the light blue, the Asia Pacific region, slightly more complex. As you saw from both the map and the graph at the beginning, A, there's more countries, and B, there's different levels of maturity or population in each of those countries. So just for the temp population, we actually have a combination of direct models, similar to the UK and the US, where we hold the direct contracts, a number where we operate indirectly, the standout example being Japan, where we run the MSP service, but the contract, the supply, and the invoicing is directly. And then for some of the smaller or remote countries, we effectively operate an on and offboarding service. So again, they've still got visibility in the 1 or 2 temps they have in Thailand, but the investment that was required to get that benefit, the ongoing maintenance cost for it, is minimal for them. So significant benefit, minimum cost in that environment. Then moving over to the US. At the US, it's predominantly the temps, so the W2 or W4 workers. We do look after some 1099 workers, but that isn't a significant part of their profile. And again, it's a direct contract, so a full procure-to-pay solution that we're looking after everything from the requisition all the way through, to the selection, the onboarding, timesheeting, payroll, the invoicing, and the offboarding for those workers. Then moving over to Europe, Europe's a bit different. In a number of European countries, there are some quite distinct definitions between a temporary worker and a contractor. Again, I said at the beginning, temporary workers are often much more akin to a permanent worker, or full-time hire, and therefore, their treatment, their benefits, etc., is quite similar. And also from a contracting perspective, therefore, an organisation requires a contract directly with the organisation payrolling them. Whereas from a contractor, again, much more viewed as a business-to-business relationship, and that therefore they're more comfortable with a business managing a relationship and a subcontract relationship and payment with those contractors. Yeah. So that gives you a little bit of mapping there. So what we've got 3 different headline solutions, and under one framework, we've actually got a different mix of them depending on the appropriateness of those organisations. Okay. But what does that actually look from a contract structure? Okay, this diagram is quite simple and quite complicated all at the same time, but in simple terms, I'm going to break it down into 3 levels for you. So we have a single global master services agreement with the organisation. So I showed you just beforehand, there's obviously quite a different bits of localization and in-country specifics, but there's still one overarching agreement with that organisation. And within that, there are what you'd expect to be in there, what I refer to as the main contract terms, liabilities, indemnities, etc. Underneath, we have 4 regional service schedules. And what a service schedule includes are the headline services, the recruitment services. So, what are the standards, what is best practice around the operational management and delivery within those countries. So again, as a line manager, when you're hiring a contingent worker or temporary worker, the service has a good degree of standardization, regardless of whether you're a manager in the UK, Hong Kong, New York, or over in Poland. Okay. However, underneath, we then have what we refer to as either functional enabling agreements or local enabling agreements, which bring out the specifics either for that category or for that country. So in the UK, we have 3 function enabling agreements because we deliver 3 different services. We've got, we're looking after the temp workers, we're looking after the statement of work on offboarding. There's actually another service we deliver them around graduate recruitment as well. In Asia, it becomes a little bit more complex. We have a number of local enabling agreements for countries where you can have a direct relationship. So again, the 3 obvious ones you'd call out there will be Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australia. And then we have a number of local enabling agreements for our indirect countries. These are countries like Japan and Malaysia, for example, where they're required to hold a direct relationship with their suppliers. But our indirect LEA is still about the managed service that we're delivering, the process management, the brokering service we deliver. In the US, more simple, we just have one LEA, because it's one territory and one largely universal service. Then moving over to Europe, we've rolled out to one country so far, where we have an LEA, and then we have a couple of other locally enabling agreements in process for delivery of it. So again, I realise it's beginning to look a little bit more complex, but at a simple level, one global agreement, which contains the primary terms, the services schedule, which details the service we deliver, and then the local enabling agreements only really identify deviations from the servicing schedule. And to bring it to life for you, if you look at the Asia Pacific one, the service schedule is 20 or 30 pages long, and details the headline service, whereas each of the LEAs is only on 1 or 2 pages, which details specific things you have to do within that country to be compliant. But again, it's very much a, not even an 80-20 rule. This is almost a 95-5 rule to get that level of consistency. Okay. Just to complete the picture, where we do operate in what we refer to a direct contract relationship, areas where we're allowed to hold the contracts with the suppliers, obviously we then have those supplier agreements sitting underneath our LEAs. So again, the UK, some of the areas in Asia Pacific, the US, and some of the countries over in Europe. Okay. So what we've gone through there is what's the scope in the individual countries or the model? What does the contract structure look like? I'm now going to move on to the people and governance structure, and you'll see it maps very closely back to the contract or the services structure. Again, so taking this from the top down, mapping back to the global governance, we have a single accountable global client director for all 4 services. So that's an individual that has overall accountability for them, and again, it allows a level of consistency, knowledge sharing, knowledge transfer, and learns transfer as well. We also have a global project team or global project office that sits at that level. These are involved particularly in services and processes. So for example, when we're rolling out a new service in a different area or expanding a service, it's the same team that is doing this again and again, not individually localized teams as well. So it's got process people, sourcing people, finance people, change people that sit in that team as well. And they sit at a global level. Then at a regional level, we have a single accountable individual per region, obviously reporting to the global client director, and again, split by the 4 regions we described in the UK, Asia Pacific, US, and over in Europe. And under them, they sit on or near site to our clients' premises. Then underneath them, we have our delivery teams. There's a couple of different roles in the team, but at a top level, we have recruiters and coordinators within that team, and they are based, in this case, the majority of them are actually based on site with the individuals. They sit within the client's premises, so they effectively look and feel like part of the client's organisation. We have quite a large team in the UK. The UK is actually our largest team. In Asia Pacific, again, mapping back to their structure or their geography, the team is actually split between Hong Kong and Singapore. We have a reasonably large team in the US, predominantly over in the New York, New Jersey area. And then for Europe, it's an expanding team based out of Poland in the first instance. Okay. Then the final part of the team, we have a number of sourcers, particularly for our APAC and our UK service, and which leads us on to the next topic. But they are individuals who are doing outreach to find and engage directly with prospective workers or previous workers under what we refer to as a direct sourcing model. Okay? And I'll come on to what that looks like in the next slide. Okay? That's people structure. Again, mapping back to the contract, global, regional, and local as well. So all rolls out consistency, but localization. Okay, sourcing models. Again, taking the 4 regions that we have, there's 2 primary models that we deliver, both for this organisation and, to be honest, most of our organisations globally. And these are what we refer to as a direct sourcing model and a neutral vendor model. So neutral vendor model is the old traditional model where the workers would be sourced from a panel or group of external suppliers. This might be split by category or geography. Then your contingent worker or your managed service program provider would be responsible for managing these suppliers and getting the best candidates from them. Increasingly, though, direct sourcing is becoming more common and is the leading solution we deliver for this organisation. And what this is here is, instead of just working with external suppliers, it's actually building your own talent acquisition capability. So actually running outreach under the name or the brand of the organisation and building up a talent pool or, in effect, a database of prospective talent that might want to work for that organisation or, in fact, have expressed an interest in working for that organisation. I'd regard this as, what we regard as de facto best practice for organisations of this type. Direct sourcing most common in mature environments, neutral vendor in some of the more emerging territories, often where you're trying to get buy-in from organisations and you're stepping the change rather than go through the change in one go. Okay. Again, what does this look like in practice? So I just put together a simple graph here that details where individuals within the current population were originally sourced from. The first source that we have for workers is referrals, often referred to as payrollees. And there's always a proportion of these. They might be people who are referred from an existing worker. They might be individuals who've worked for a previous comparable organisation or worked with individuals before. And we have a number of those across most of the population or most of the territories. Interestingly, it's highest in the UK, but I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the most mature of the 4 programs. So again, it's kind of built up a reputation and it's built up a critical mass of individuals who may have worked there previously or may have been attracted directly to it. The second source of workers or resources or expertise would come from external suppliers. And on the right-hand side, the territories where we work under a neutral vendor structure, that's where the rest of the workers come from. So in the US and then also in Europe, the significant proportion, or almost the entirety in Europe at the moment, are then sourced from partner suppliers, third-party suppliers, supplier partners, other external agencies or staffing providers. However, on the left-hand side, where we work under a direct sourcing, the number of workers that now come from these other sources has decreased. And the number of workers that are now sourced under the brand of the organisation and have been attracted directly to the organisation or engaged about opportunities directly now accounts for a significant proportion of those hires. So it's highest in Asia Pacific. Okay, they don't have quite as high a payrollee population. But what you can see in both of those, now 20% or less of the population has come from those external providers. It arguably gives benefit on both costs, engagement of those workers, but makes you more self-sufficient, self-reliant as an organisation as well. So that's the difference in the sourcing models. So we've gone through what's the scope, what's the contract structure, what is the people structure, how does it look from a sourcing perspective, and then the final piece of the jigsaw that I will come through is technology. Missed one bit. Having said that the direct sourcing is our main area in the ones where we do direct sourcing, our US service, which is a newer service, we're moving that into a direct sourcing environment in the rest of 2018, and I would expect the US over the long term to largely map to what the UK environment looks like. Again, mainly New York, mainly the UK, are very much quite mature contracting environments as well. They have more similarities and differences. So we're looking to bring the client on the journey towards the UK model for the US. As I said, final piece of the jigsaw would be around technology. They do have a VMS technology deployed. They effectively have regional instances. There aren't many single global deployments of VMSs. There are considerations that need to take into account both from a configuration perspective and a practicality perspective, whether they were rolled out at different times, etc. But in reality, these have 4 different deployments. However, we do roll this up from the various different exports to give them global dashboards. So going back to my original people team, I was talking about the global project team, and this is where that comes into its own, in being able to have a consolidated or single view of what is going on across the population, allows them to compare, contrast, and benchmark one region against the other. And you can obviously see where things have succeeded or areas for improvement as well. Okay. Okay, I said earlier, not all of this happened overnight. So I keep calling out the 4 regions as semi-separate. They're sort of semi-autonomous services under one global framework and contract. But how did this come about? So the UK contract is about over 10 years old now. So it went live in 2005. There's been a number of steps and evolutions during that time, but the key ones are around the launch of direct sourcing and the launch of the statement of work or externals onboarding, which brings us today. When we started off, it was a standalone. It was managed in region. Now, in the same way that we have a global governance framework and approach, the organisation does as well. So we brought it to 2018. We've now brought it under a global governance framework. Asia Pacific started in 2016. We did it in 2 phases. The first phase was the 3 primary countries, and then there was a second phase. In reality, there was a phase 2.1 and 2.2, where we rolled out into the secondary and the tertiary countries. Again, going back to my messaging at the beginning, looking at where is the benefit and what is the return on investment and what services you look for. So we rolled out in effect the direct countries first, where was the most benefit for quality, risk, control, and speed. Then the indirect countries, where you still had a number of the benefits around quality and cost, maybe not the processing on the invoice. And then on the third phase is when we rolled out to the on and offboarding countries, the smaller, lower volume countries. But again, the cost of deployment there was minimal because we looked at that on and offboarding module in the first instance, but still getting visibility. And again, brings us today, and it was brought into the global governance framework in 2018. The US was actually only launched in 2017. And if that graph was to continue on, you would see the launch of direct sourcing. It's just being launched as we speak. We're going through the implementation phase for it. And again, it will be hopefully following the journey that the UK has, but hopefully at a greater speed. And then, sorry, was there a question?
Yeah, Rob, sorry, this is Kimball. We've had a couple questions come in around direct sourcing, and I figured it might be simpler if we answer them here in the context of, the discussion before we wrap up. The first is, how is he using the term direct sourcing here? And I believe that's probably around some of the industry vernacular, where direct sourcing versus self-sourcing, I think sometimes get confused.
Okay. If I can say that, so direct sourcing for us, so this is members of our team, so they are members of the MSP team, and what they are doing is they are running campaign and outreach programs on behalf of our client organisation. So to put this in real terms for you, we would advertise roles under their brand. We would do networking and referrals under their brand. We would do screening exclusively for them. And then these candidates would be, as far as possible, they would be owned, or they would be exclusively for that organisation. So the people doing that, they're not part of any other staffing business or any other, they just work for that one client. So again, just to bring that to life for you, we have a team of 4 or 5 in our London MSP team, and their role is exclusively building up a talent pool or database of candidates solely for this organisation and no other clients. And as you see, that accounts for 50-odd% of the total population. now.
Perfect. Yeah, we've often, just to piggyback on that, we often refer to this as RPO for contingent, right?
Yeah.
And that I think really puts it into context in terms of the level of work and recruiting that we're doing in a direct source model versus self-sourcing, which is often where managers are just finding their own talent and handing them off to a payroll function to engage the worker for their project.
Yeah, I mean, the self-sourcing still goes on. That referral section I was referring to. So if a manager does have a previous contact that they know is good for the role, we'll obviously manage the benchmarking and the rate for them, the compliance program. But you see in the UK that accounts for 30 or so % of the population that people and managers know. People are MSP team then account for about just under 50% of them, and that means they're only reliant on a third party or external provider for 20% of their workers.
Perfect. Now, Rob, I don't want to derail us, but there was one other direct sourcing question that came through. I just want to lump them together here. The question, and I'll synopsize here, they're referencing the fact that the UK is the most mature market in the case study we cited, and they're asking, is direct sourcing a natural step following the first-gen vendor-neutral program, or is that something we can immediately implement, and what would the challenges be?
So the answer is both. We often, it depends on the country and the environment and you as an organisation. If both changes at the same time, might make the change program more difficult, then we might envisage a step program. So, for example, taking this client in the US, we launched as a neutral vendor, but we then launched direct sourcing within about 3 months of going live. And so the double message on day one of, you've got to change we're bringing in some controls to the process and we're changing, your sourcing structure, it might have met with, the change program would have been more difficult. But once we'd established, BAU, they bought into the program, then actually it was a very easy sell to the stakeholders because it was an additional service we were delivering for them and actually was then reviewed as an enhancement or an improvement rather than necessarily a change. So my answer to you would be almost immediately, but you might actually couch it as a phased program, but those two phases could run almost consecutively.
That makes sense. Very good. Thanks, Rob. And
cool.
Back to the regularly scheduled programming.
No, you'll be back in a minute anyway, Kimball. So just bringing this all together then. So you can see that there has been an evolution here. The bits around that, there's different VMS systems, there's different structures. But what we've worked with them as they've become more global as well. Their decision making used to be on a regionalised basis. Their decision making has moved to a globalised basis. And we've worked with them, for example, to make sure the initial MSA that we signed in the UK. We've then negotiated and adapted it to make sure that it's then applicable to add in any of these other services as well. Each of the service schedules, is largely mapped to the previous one. And they look like brothers and sisters. They look like they're related. And it's now brought us to 2018, where they've now got an overarching governance framework, which brings us today. It's quite an exciting period for us as well, because now that we've brought it together in a single framework, they've brought it together in a single framework, there's global decision making from both sides. That's enabling some much more joined up thinking on the strategy and the development. We have people on these various different regional bits who've worked on multiple, myself included, and that means that the speed of change is accelerating significantly to what we would regard as a global best practice framework in the future. Okay. So that brings to an end. So hopefully there we've got, what should you consider, then what are the options, and then with one particular organisation, how have they mapped those particular options to them as an organisation to fit their objectives. So I'm not saying what we've demonstrated now is exactly what you should have as an organisation, but the logic is the same. Where are you trying to go? Where are you trying to go? Where's the opportunity for you? Where's the cost? Where's the cost and development sit? And then how do you get that? So you get the biggest advantage for hopefully the minimal change or investment on both parts. Okay. So that brings us to the end. I'm actually going to hand back to Kimball now, who's going to give us a quick summary, and then we're going to open this to Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. And certainly, in one word, wow. It's easy to see why we get so many, comments and questions around the topic of globalization. It's complex, certainly not easy, but as you've seen from this case study, it's absolutely doable with some thought and care around the program. Always striving to balance the objectives and benefits around the globe and manage that complexity. So next slide, please. So we took the liberty of surveying kind of our internal implementation team and our own experiences and came up with some extremely high level, but I think very useful guidelines and advice for anyone interested in the topic of globalization or going down the path of actually implementing this kind of a program or program expansion. So these are, again, high-level takeaways that hopefully you'll find some benefit from. The first is to do your research. This sounds obvious, but really, as Rob spent some time talking about balancing the objectives and benefits and building a business case, I think it's really important to understand what you're trying to solve for and define that opportunity by region or by country in your organization, because it may not be the same thing and very much driven by the business needs and the contingent population in that area. The second would be to calibrate your ambitions. Again, this is all about strategy before tactics and really building a thoughtful and detailed roadmap with the end state in mind. The third, hopefully, as you've heard Rob speak today, finding a capable partner is so important. Really having a strategic advisor and a guide that'll help you design and implement a program clearly much easier than going it alone or inventing something new. Next would be to build a rollout plan. Rob mentioned the big bang approach. One of the conversations we often have in the market is, what's the better approach? Launch this all at once across the globe, which obviously has some advantages from a communication perspective, but it is also tempting but very dangerous in terms of just the complexity and having the change management spiral out of control. So we often advise that it's much more advantageous to think of this in terms of logical increments or stages as you roll a program like this out, which is a natural lead into the next comment, and that is to communicate, communicate, communicate. You can't over-communicate when you're doing this kind of change management within an organization. It touches all aspects of the business and certainly is something that we've observed many companies tend to underestimate, and that's a critical mistake. Next would be to align your internal stakeholders. As we march down this globalization discussion, right, both in terms of contingent workforce management, but also from a talent supply and demand equation perspective, we're going towards the path of what many in the HR circles are calling total talent management, and making sure that your vision and objectives match up between the different functional areas that touch your program, whether that be HR, procurement, talent acquisition, legal, finance. There are many interested parties, both from a management but also from a consumption perspective, that you want to make sure you've got that alignment. And again, much like communication, many companies tend to underestimate the importance of this up front. And finally, from a responsive and capable program, you want to build in the governance process that really defines how this is going to work, both in terms of process, but rules of engagement, decision-making. The goal is, as Rob has stated a number of times today, to build a program that delivers the talent you need when they need it, but can also flex to fit the local and regional requirements and objectives that you might have. So with that, that concludes the presentation we've shared or we've prepared for you today. We do have a couple minutes for Q&A. One other one came in, Rob, that I wanted to share with you. If you want to take a pass at this, it says, we're a large multinational company. Do you have an opinion on a single global MSP versus regional MSPs? Which is a question we have heard a number of times out in the marketplace as well.
Yes, so The simple answer is it depends, which I know isn't very helpful. But you would want the best or most appropriate one per region. That doesn't necessarily have to be the same one, but it doesn't necessarily have to be different. So you'll notice in this particular example, for full disclosure, there is a fifth region, a smaller region, which is actually managed by a different partner. So even this organisation has, four-fifths they work with one provider, and the other fifth they work with the other one. In my experience, it would be unusual to have one provider that was that might be the most appropriate in all territories. So a best of breed per territory, but under a single governance or technology. I mean, interestingly, we're working with another company at the moment. They've got a couple of regional MSPs, but we're going to have we're working with a global program office for both governance and particularly for BI and reporting. So a single provider. So Hayes will be the single provider for governance and BA on a globalized basis. But under that, they're working with regional MSP providers. So as looking at your different environment, the number of the ones that I'm familiar with that work on a best practice have a small number of providers who might work across a number of regions, but maybe not a single one on a global basis.
Yeah, that makes sense. Very good. And with that, I believe we're at the hour. So again, I thank everyone who came in and heard Rob present today. Hopefully you got some value out of it. Please feel free to reach out if there's anything more we can answer for you. And with that, we'll let you get back to your day jobs. Thanks again, everyone. And Laura, I don't know if there's a wrap-up that you want to...
Yep, no, thanks everyone for attending, and we'll be sending out the recording shortly in an email. Have a great day, all.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, thank you, everyone.